RDG Planning and Design is a nationally recognized multidisciplinary firm offering professional services in architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, lighting design, strategic planning, urban and comprehensive planning and design, graphic design, engineering, and integrated and public art. Diverse in knowledge and experience, they are united in their pursuit to create meaning together with their clients and in their communities, and by their drive to live responsibly and do it well. Decades of dedication to success have taken them around the world, and today their commitment to communication and technology allows them to engage clients anywhere from their offices in Colorado, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms, to another episode of Booked on Planning. In this episode, we talk with author Erica Avrami on her book, Second Order Preservation: Social Justice and Climate Action Through Heritage Policy. I first heard Erica talk about these concepts last summer when she spoke as the keynote for the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions Forum Conference. I immediately added her book to our list for this year's reading.
And second order preservation really makes you take a hard look at the policies surrounding preservation and why we do the things we do. I thought Erica's point that we don't really consider who is burdened well enough was very eye-opening. I at least really only used to start thinking about the benefits of historic preservation, but I never thought about who was burdened on the other side of that preservation.
Yeah, having worked in the field of preservation for so many years, it felt like we were always just fighting for relevance, let alone having time to consider our larger societal impacts. But the book offered a really thought-provoking divergence from the embedded approach in preservation that you preserve the building first and then all the other benefits are going to follow.
So let's get into our conversation with author Erica Avrami on second order preservation, social justice, and climate action through heritage policy.
Erica, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Second Order Preservation: Social Justice and Climate Action Through Heritage Policy. Second order thinking was a new concept to me. First order being a focus on objects, second order thinking more broadly about impacts. Can you talk about how second order applies to the field of preservation?
Absolutely. It's really shorthand for thinking about the implications of decisions. And in the context of historic preservation, we have often looked at this act of saving something as primary and all the other benefits as coming as a result of that primary act. So we have a building, we don't want it to be lost or torn down. We save that building through designation, and then all of the economic, environmental, and social benefits can ensue as a result of that protection. What second order preservation tries to get us thinking about is some of those longer term intentions. All of our laws around preservation here in the United States talk about things like economic stability, economic vitality, incentivizing tourism, ensuring civic welfare, environmental benefits in some cases. And so we don't necessarily take those metrics into consideration when we're making the decisions about what to save or what not to save. And what second order helps to promote, I hope, is consideration of those implications and how to really better incorporate those longer term intentions into decision making.
Yeah, so many of our designation criteria are on the architecture, the social history, whether there's archaeological influences, and they don't really get beyond that. Maybe our ordinances say the goals of our preservation are to do all of these other things, but we never designate any buildings for those specific goals. We really limit it to what is this building architecturally doing for the preservation field.
Absolutely. And so thinking about the implications of those decisions is what takes us to that broader set of intentions.
And can you walk us through how we got the historic preservation policies we have in place now, those first order thinking policies, and why do you think those policies have seen so little change over the years?
So I want to be fair to the field. and emphasize the fact that we do have a diverse toolbox. There's regulation, there's transfer of property rights, there are different types of tax incentives, different kinds of ownership structures. And so we do have a diverse toolbox, but so many of those tools are contingent upon this idea of being on a list or being designated. And that concept, though it's been around in governments, particularly European governments, for a few hundred years, it really has shaped the way we think about the work of preservation under the rubric of government significantly in the modern era. And so everything that we do is really about, is it on the list or is it not on the list? And I think that concept, that very binary concept of, is it worthy of being listed, not worthy of being listed, has really shaped policy today and involved at the time of a lot of our kind of modern legislation, 1960s. For example, when the National Historic Preservation Act came into play, the New York City Landmarks Law came into play, there really were a number of different interests involved, but a lot of those interests represented architecture, architectural history. And so it was the idea of curating the built environment. Even James Marston Fitch, who taught historic preservation at Columbia, who I hold a professorship that's in his name, he published a seminal text on the curatorial management of the built environment. And that idea that somehow architecture was like objects that we were looking at through an aesthetic lens, also a social history lens. I think that really influenced this thinking of the materiality, the aesthetics, and the way in which architecture is really a designed object that has a function, but isn't considered as much as a socially dynamic space. And I think, the policies then, that kind of idea of, are you on the list, are you not on the list? The before and after photographs, all of those kind of emphasize the material, the aesthetic, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the only incentive that we've had, to my knowledge, that goes beyond is it on the list or not on the list, and we've lost it since then, was the federal tax credit for old buildings, not necessarily designated buildings. It wasn't quite as much as if you were actually on the list, but it was one incentive that helped with preserving an older building, not a listed building.
Absolutely. You raise an excellent point. And the loss of that 10% tax credit for older buildings, what many people don't realize is that emerged during the oil crisis. The tax incentives for what we call today historic tax credits actually started as rehabilitation tax credits. And they were rationalized in Congress in debates about these laws on issues of embodied energy. There was an oil embargo, gasoline was very high, and there was more and more research about both the operational energy required to use buildings as well as the embodied energy required to construct new buildings. And so the reuse of existing buildings, particularly in city centers, was seen as a way to conserve energy. And so the federal government endorsed these rehabilitation tax credits with a tiered system, starting at 10%, just as you said, for older buildings, and then going up to 25% if the building was on the National Register. And so that really had a different orientation to it. But over time, the tax credits have evolved, and preservationists have really focused on preserving the ones specifically for historic buildings. And the loss of the 10% tax credit, I think, is something that we really need to reconsider, particularly in the context of a climate crisis.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting in that section of the book where you're talking about all of this, how the foundation for the embodied energy argument for historic preservation was a little bit not super thorough, or the study that it was based on wasn't all that well researched. And we've just taken that and run with it. And still today, I mean, that we talk about the greenest building is the one that's standing, and we harken back to that image of the building as a gas can that was done during that time. But it really comes down to not necessarily just an old building's a better building, but are you upgrading that older building and making it more efficient and tightening up the envelope? Because just having an old building isn't the most efficient after all.
Right. Research that is emerging now, when we look at this from the perspective of carbon, not simply energy, but carbon that's being emitted, we see more and more studies that demonstrate that deep retrofit of existing buildings and historic buildings actually are what make them better performers from a carbon perspective, not simply saving old buildings. And that means significant change for historic buildings in some cases. And that's going to be challenging, A, because energy codes exempt most historic buildings, at least buildings that are on or eligible for the National Register. And the new decarbonization laws that are coming online, or the greenhouse gas laws, some of them do exempt historic buildings and some of them don't. And so that arena of legislation is still emerging, and it's kind of coming up through municipalities and states. So it's something I'm trying to track and look at to understand its implications.
Yeah, last year we actually interviewed the authors of the book, The Power of Existing Buildings.
Mhm.
And it was such a great insight in how we can still very much honor and respect the history of significant buildings, older buildings, while bringing them up to code and making them more efficient buildings in the end of the day. It was a very good read.
So our focus on place-based and individual building designation rarely takes into consideration the impacts that we'd see beyond just saving that one building. So what does deconstructing an approach like this look like?
I raise some thoughts in the book. I don't have solutions yet. We're working on those. And in some ways I think solutions have to be flexible. We need to be considering differences of place and what some of those kind of guidances are. But I do think being much more intentional about what preservation is supposed to achieve is important in that pursuit. If we're really interested in ensuring distributive justice, meaning the decision to preserve something has benefited people without overly burdening other people, then we need to be devoting resources to going back and studying places after they've been designated for a while and really looking at what are the long-term effects of this process, whether it's economic, environmental, social. I also think we need to be more intentional about what designation is supposed to achieve for a community or for a society. Again, the building is saved, but some people may be advocating for saving that building because they see its economic potential for tourism development. Others may be seeing the protection of that building simply as a place that they can continue to walk by, and its preservation protects a street wall or a certain view shed, and they want to see that survive in perpetuity. And so people have different expectations of how preservation is supposed to perform and how those buildings or that heritage is supposed to perform. And I'd love to see more debates about that at the time something is listed or designated, and that we come back and revisit those intentions to see if indeed they were achieved or not achieved. One way of doing that is temporary designations. What if generationally we had to review a designation every 20, 30 years? Other countries, for example, have graded listings. The UK has grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 listings, meaning certain grades you can do a lot more work on it without as much scrutiny around, is it exactly the same type of window, or are you using appropriate materials, versus other buildings where more care should be taken around what changes are made and how it can affect the heritage values, original form, original materials, etc. So I do think that there are a number of options out there. It involves really having more public conversations at the time of that designation is being considered about how we want heritage to perform for people.
And you make the point in the book that we've landed on a fear and victim model. Basically, we're very afraid of losing a historic building. We're afraid of losing the historic character when you don't put in those exact same windows, and what you call the enterprise approach to preservation. So, how should we think about moving away from that fear and victim model as you started talking about talking to people moving on?
One of the things that emerges in the heritage literature is this idea that heritage is not a renewable resource. So that underpins this idea that if we lose it, we will never get it back. I argue that heritage is absolutely a renewable resource. We keep creating heritage every day. We have, our heritage lists are long. There are more than 1,000 World Heritage Sites. There's the National Register, when you think about actual individual properties, has more than 1 million on it. So it's not that heritage is not a renewable resource. And so I think we need to unpack that a little bit and recognize that this fear of loss isn't always about it can't be replaced or there aren't other options. And I think this ties pretty directly to notions of authenticity, this idea that if we lose it, it will no longer be authentic, or if we change it too much, it will no longer be authentic. And I think that authenticity is a really thorny concept that we rely on, and that it has many more dimensions that we're failing to recognize through our designation criteria, and that ultimately the opposite of authentic is not inauthentic, but rather just indefinite, right? This idea that authentic is somewhat singular. It's what we see or what we think is original, for example, but it's okay. So much of our heritage is not, has so many aspects of it that are not original, that we need to, I think, be a little more open and accepting of buildings adapting over time for environmental, social, and economic reasons. That's why they've survived. That's why these older buildings are still here. It's because they have been adaptable over time. And if we don't think about preservation as ensuring that capacity to transfer across generations, and instead focus on, no, we just need to keep it exactly how it is, then we're going to be in trouble, right? We need to focus on that intergenerational transfer, and that intergenerational transfer of the freedom to identify heritage, to create heritage, to adapt heritage, and not so much about this notion that these are objects that we have to steward from one generation to the next.
On the heritage and authenticity, one of the examples you use in the book is the reconstruction of the quarters that the soldiers were living in the winter, that awful winter of the Revolutionary War, versus the slave houses at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello.
Yeah.
One, we were like, yes, we still need to see this representation. We know that we have good documentation that it would probably kind of look like this, so we recreate it. And then the slave houses were like, they don't exist anymore. We don't have enough information. It was so fascinating to think through anybody's thought process of why one is acceptable and should be seen and why the other was not. It was just crazy. That's what kind of led me to the question.
Yeah, no, it's that example truly derives from my childhood, because I grew up right near Jockey Hollow and the Morristown Historical Park, which is the oldest historical park in the United States. Our parks up until that point were really focused on nature as heritage. And so the site of that encampment during the Revolutionary War, like those soldiers' huts, we went to them all the time, as kids. As teenagers, friends smoked their first cigarette in those huts, and all sorts of things would happen in those huts. And so they were part of this landscape that I was so familiar with. And it wasn't until I got much older and I was looking at histories of Reconstruction and then following the debates at Monticello about whether or not it was okay or quote unquote authentic to reconstruct the quarters of enslaved peoples on an 18th century plantation, right? I mean, what is less authentic? Not having that spatial encounter with the enslavement of peoples, or having a structure that is in some ways representative, but maybe not exactly how it was originally. And we're okay with that in all of these national parks with these soldier hut reconstructions. So it is a fascinating comparison, absolutely. And I'm so glad it resonated with you.
And you point out that when we're trying to diversify the stories that we're telling, the heritage that we're representing, that just adding more diverse sites to the National Register or our local landmark registers isn't fixing the issue in the field of preservation. What other steps should we be taking to move beyond this first order approach that we've been stuck in?
Yeah, I don't in any way mean to say that so many of the efforts that are happening to diversify historic registers and to enhance the diversity of designated properties. I think there's so much amazing work that's happening from the local level to the national level to do that. And I think it is necessary, but that is an additive approach. We are doing more, adding more to the rosters. It doesn't necessarily change the systemic issues, which are what are the rules of the game? What are the criteria? How are the Secretary of the Interior standards functioning in ways that work for or against broader representation of stories in our landscape? It's not getting at the distributive justice question either, meaning how does this designation of an historic district impact some community members, advantage them or disadvantage them? If you're in that National Register district and you don't have to comply with energy codes, others do if they're outside that National Register district. FEMA responds differently for owners of properties that are on the National Register than those that are not. And so that kind of distributive justice question and those procedural justice questions are really embedded in the work of government. The rules, the standards, the designation criteria, the regulatory processes, all of those things are ways that we take decisions that need to be rethought and reformed, essentially, in order to ensure that we're not always trying to just add more, but rather we're changing the fundamental issues that are underpinning why we have so much more representation of white, male, wealthy histories in our landscape, as opposed to those histories that represent women, people of color, LGBTQ communities, et cetera.
I think this is happening more at the local level. There's some larger cities. I think Denver is a good example where their designation criteria has grown significantly. I think they have like 7, 8, 9 criteria that goes beyond just the building as an object kind of designation
Mhm.
criteria, where they're trying to expand properties that could be designated and recognizing other histories. Federal level, I think, is way behind on this, and it just takes so much work to move anything. I mean, it took us forever to get the Secretary of the Interior standards updated. So I think it needs to start there, but how quickly?
Yes, and I take your point. There are, though, the idea of historic context themes and trying to develop, for example, national historic landmarks that are more representative of the American public. There's good work that has been done. There really is good work that has been done. But when we look at how you change policy on the ground, particularly in the context of more significant regulation, right? The National Register, there's limited regulatory effect by being on the National Register. If I owned a building, I could get it listed on the National Register and then tear it down the next day, as long as I wasn't using federal monies for that demolition. If it's locally designated, no, then it incurs more regulatory process. And that's in part because so much of our regulation, land use, zoning, property taxes, all of that happens for the most part on that municipal level. That's where the regulation is in many ways most stringent for preservation, at that local level, where commissions are reviewing additions or changes to historic buildings, petitions for demolition, and the designation process.
Stephanie actually brought our first thematic district to the city of Lincoln, as opposed to just an area like our
Mhm.
Haymarket. The thematic idea was local grocery stores. Lincoln used to be well known for all these little corner grocery stores. And so, is this where we got the idea, Stephanie, to do thematic? How did you come to that?
Thematic was building off of the multiple property documentation form at the national
Yeah.
level, and
Mhm.
knowing that we had all these small little individual corner stores that were left in neighborhoods, but we've zoned them out of use, so you can't really do a whole lot with them. They're just sitting vacant. And I wanted to come up with a way that we could designate them and get around some of the zoning, because we also have a special permit for historic preservation that allows you to waive pretty much any zoning requirement you want to through the Planning Commission.
Wow.
So you can do other uses. It is an amazing tool.
Yeah.
Um, so we came up with this idea of a thematic district, so you could get all of the corner stores scattered throughout all these older neighborhoods, designate them under a discontiguous district, And then that opens them up for the special permit to be able to do other uses besides just a single family home in some of these 1 or 2 story commercial buildings.
That's great. Oh, that's fascinating. And I mean, and that's an example where this isn't simply about there is a famous architect who designed that building, or there's a particular event that happened at that place, or it's representative of a particular style. You're really looking at the social spatial dynamics of those places and the ways in which they have served communities. And even if they're not serving communities today, what you're doing is trying to enable their longevity and adaptation. And that's the transfer across generations issue, right? And the way in which creative tools around planning and preservation intersect and allow communities and governments to advance this kind of work is fantastic. And I absolutely applaud it. And while I may talk a lot about about some of the antiquated issues in our preservation toolbox, I still think that there are so many creative ways in which, particularly at the local level, municipalities are finding interesting ways of charting preservation pathways. There are things like legacy businesses function differently in different municipalities, and different municipalities are looking at intangible heritage in different ways. So I think there is a lot of creativity, and I have a lot of hope that our municipal level will continue to demonstrate that really forward-thinking policy landscape.
And keeping in the theme of Lincoln's history, I guess, Stephanie and I were actually also just talking about trying to put together a red light district walking tour or something. But it's very difficult to do something like that because a lot of the buildings are no longer there. But this is what seemed to me an example of survivorship bias. Like that history still exists in Lincoln, whether the building is there to put a sign on that says this is part of our red light district. So, how does survivorship bias impact how we identify and lift up certain heritages or diminish and sweep away others?
That's a great example. Thank you. And that idea of survivorship bias in the book is really about the way in which traditionally preservationists have done surveys, right? You walk a neighborhood, you do a windscreen survey in a car to sort of identify what survives in the landscape. And all too often, political forces, building codes, forms of discrimination have influenced how and why some buildings survive and others don't, or why some neighborhoods survive and others don't. Everything from redlining to the fact that many histories, as you said, that red light district, many LGBTQ histories, the history of emancipation, right? Underground Railroad histories, for example. So many of those places and activities had to be furtive. They had to be secretive because of the potential illegality or violence or societal pushback against those activities could have incurred if they were more public. And so as a consequence, there are not a lot of records, right? We create this idea that, well, preservation needs to be built on documentation and we need good archives. And do we have any drawings? Do we have any photographs? Do we have anything written describing this place? And those places very specifically did not, tried to stay under the radar. And so when we create these standards in preservation, and say you must be able to show this evidence or rationalize this based on this kind of documentation, and that documentation doesn't exist, then those stories are disadvantaged in the canon of history as it's represented in the built environment. They will be more vulnerable to demolition. They will not be as represented on heritage rosters. And I think that that's really problematic because it just centers certain histories above others. And in order to tell that fuller story, we need to be thinking about the implications of all of these rules, right? And all of these standards in order to be more inclusive.
The example in your book that made me think of mine was the house, I believe maybe in New York City, that was potentially an Underground Railroad safe place, but it couldn't get listed partly for two reasons. One, there wasn't enough evidence overall to show that it was an Underground Railroad stop. That was the point, is that it wouldn't stand out as an Underground Railroad. And then some of the architectural features had been removed. And it was at that point that I did kind of want to throw your book. I'm not going to lie. Like, I was just so mad. Why? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. But part of it is that everyone's trying to play by those rules of the game, right? That everyone's trying to do their due diligence in terms of adhering to designation criteria, periods of significance, understanding designation criteria effectively. And I want to respect that. But at the same time, this kind of work is trying to lay bare, as so many other people's projects and research is trying to lay bare, that the system, the rules of the game and how we enforce them and how we interpret them is not serving the general public. And if we want to better serve, if we're thinking about preservation as a form of public policy, if we want to better serve that broader public, then we need to be very self-reflective and look at some of those effects.
Well, I think one of the issues with why we're so set on following the rules, having all these standards, being pretty strict about what we designate and what we don't designate is we've been fighting for relevance as a field, that historic preservation matters. And there's all these campaigns, and we kind of latch onto this idea of we have economic benefits or the greenest building benefits. But you point out that the burdens of historic preservation are sorely under-researched. So can you talk about some of the burdens that we tend to overlook that having this kind of very strict approach and listed or not listed has?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've actually touched upon a number of them, right? That burden to produce evidence, even if information and stories have been passed down across generations. Is there enough original material? Is it representative of the period of significance? That's a burden on certain publics who have been disadvantaged, who didn't have the access to capital, for example, to maintain a property because of redlining and urban renewal, et cetera. And so that, in effect, disadvantages them, right, in the preservation process. Whereas those who have the documentation, have all that original material, had access to capital in order to maintain a place over time, they are advantaged in the process. I mentioned earlier the work of FEMA, right, in post-disaster situations. We're looking at a new era of significant change in the built environment due to the increase in frequency and severity of weather events, flooding, fire, drought, so many things. And particularly, for example, flooding, whether it's coastal flooding, inland flooding, we're seeing this increase. And that means we need to be considering, okay, how are we either retrofitting for floods in place? How are we thinking about relocation, whether forced or voluntary relocation? Are we just going to keep building in the same spots over and over again, using federal monies to help support disaster recovery, or are we going to consider other ways? And when we consider other ways, let's say I want to put a berm around my house, elevate my house and put a berm around my house. That may protect me from flooding. It will make my neighbors more vulnerable to flooding because the water still goes somewhere. And the same thing for example, coastal communities that have the resources to build a seawall. Great. But the community next door, the water will go somewhere. And so, the way we think about these things is really compounded by the climate crisis. And so we see efforts afoot to try and preserve or prioritize historic districts or historic sites in the process of flood adaptation or climate adaptation, for example. And I think we need to be considering what those implications are for not just those property owners and those properties themselves, but also for others. And that's sort of what I mean about the benefits and the burdens. Are we giving more assistance to a community because it's historic and therefore we want to ensure that it is elevated? But how has that now burdened an adjacent community that isn't elevated and is now more vulnerable to flooding?
In the book, you also talk about Ahmad Faki Almandi's destruction of cultural property in Timbuktu in 2012. It's a very famous case we used a very punitive punishment system as the group that he represented technically created a bunch of destruction. But we are actually starting to see a resurgence of these types of attacks currently, as well as we see more war coming into the world again. So, how could we begin to think about utilizing restorative justice practices instead of punitive justice practices as we think about historic preservation and what that type of destruction means?
That's such an interesting case, in part because that case helped to develop the International Criminal Court's policy on cultural heritage. And what we see in the legal arena is more and more consideration of cultural heritage as a human right, which is important, right? It's important to recognize that this is a critical and undeniable dimension of the human experience. Again, though, like I kind of push on this question of it's about the freedom to transfer that heritage across generations, not necessarily to save a particular object. And I think the restorative justice question really forces us to consider what that means. In that case, there were some restorative justice efforts, even though it was very punitive, as you said, and there's mixed results as a consequence of that process in terms of what communities felt they got out of it, right, and what they didn't. And what was super interesting was while that process was happening, while the charges were being developed and prepared for trial, the places were actually reconstructed through a community engaged process, which kind of goes back to that question of, is heritage renewable, right? Like it can be reconstructed. And so part of what I argue is there are these restorative acts, and restorative not simply in the preservation form of restoration, but forms of restorative justice that are important for us to consider. And reconstruction is among those. We have already talked about the quarters of enslaved peoples at Monticello. In my mind, that is an act of restorative justice, the recreation of those places so that people can spatially encounter those conditions. In the same way we did that for the soldiers' huts is important. It's a form of restorative justice for those who have not been represented in the history we encounter in the built environment. Yet, reconstruction is sort of the last option in preservation decision making, right? Reconstruction is sort of seen as, oh, well, if you have enough documentation, if you can demonstrate how it was before, we can do this. And if you're really meticulous about how you do it and try and do it as authentically as possible. And I think so much of the restorative justice endeavor is about enabling people to claim space in ways that allow a transfer of heritage that may not be about a particular object anymore, in part because the object may be lost or have been transformed so dramatically or completely obliterated, right, by a new office building, for example. And so how we claim space in different ways around that loss and recognize that history, still recognizing its ties to geography and to place, I think are important in the restorative justice dimensions of our work. And again, it goes back to that question of the rules. We need to rethink some of those rules. We need to think about reconstruction very differently if our intention is restorative justice.
Yeah, because even if you do reconstruct and are able to come up with a solution, you still can't designate it anymore because it's almost impossible to get a reconstructed building listed. So you'll never be able to put it on a list, and you'll never access all the extra benefits of being on that list.
Right. And we encounter a very similar issue with moving buildings that, even a building that's in a flood zone or in a fire zone, and there's an interest in relocating it. Again, if it's on the National Register, it will go off the National Register. You would have to reapply and make a new case for it to be on the register. So yeah, I mean, those, again, it's the rules of the game. And we need to kind of think about some of those rules. In the book, I use this very simplistic analogy of playing soccer and how as kids, you might have played soccer in the street in somebody's backyard, not had a net, et cetera. But as you kind of go up in the hierarchy of competitive sports, there are more rules and there are more standards that you have to abide by. And the same goes for preservation. Societies, people preserve all the time. But if we want to do that within the construct of public policy, under the rubric of government and in ways that allow for us to access the resources, the taxpayer resources, for lack of a better way of saying that, then we have to abide by certain rules. And those rules need to be standardized so that it's equitable. Right? Everyone wants to know what are the rules so that they can access it, so that they can play the game. And that's where we bump up against a tension that, the more we standardize those rules, the more we risk exclusion and not recognizing the very diverse arena of heritage that we are seeking to preserve and the social spatial relationships associated with them. It's really about thinking how those rules can be made more flexible, how they can be reformed. And I give a quick example of all the different ways in which the rules of soccer have changed over decades, and we should be able to change our rules. It happens in public policy all the time where we make changes. But as preservationists, there's just going back to that question of fear that you raised earlier, Jennifer, that I don't know if I fully responded to, but that sense of loss, right? It's not just about the buildings, it's about our status quo. And that there's this fear that if we change the rules or try to change the rules, the whole house will come tumbling down. And how do we make changes about designation criteria or standards of reconstruction or restoration or rehabilitation without potentially having these uncertain ripple effects? And I think part of what the book argues for in this concept of second order preservation is, listen, we can't always anticipate all of those ripple effects, but we can anticipate some of them. There are different scenarios that we can play out and consider, and we can also think about this incrementally. And I don't think anyone anticipated, for example, when they sought in the 1970s an exemption from energy performance codes. There are all these arguments about how modern buildings were like the worst performers, and that's the reason why only historic buildings should be exempt. And now all of those mid-century modern buildings are being designated. So, again, it doesn't take a lot to bring a little more forethought into our policy making. That example always makes me chuckle. Did we just never think that a modern building might be designated? Did we just think that the only historic buildings that would ever be on a list are, quaint little homes and palatial mansions and churches and things like that? Maybe. But I think there's enough intellectual curiosity within our field to be able to anticipate some of these things and seek avenues of policy reform that really would be beneficial in the long term.
So to follow that up, who should be leading the policy reform and changing the rules?
I think, honestly, it needs to be a coalition, right? It needs to be involving government. It needs to involve universities. I mean, we have now what we didn't have in the 1960s when we saw a lot of this legislation coming on board. We had one historic preservation program at Columbia. Now we have a number of historic preservation programs. We have more research that's emerging. We have the capacity to do more policy research. And I think that universities have a significant role to play in trying to undertake some of that work and get it to happen. I think governments need to be more accountable to this idea that all we do is keep designating and regulating the things that are designated and not evaluating the effects or implications of the things that we have already designated on people as well as places. I think that's a dimension of government accountability that needs to be reckoned with. And I do think that the third sector, the not-for-profit and philanthropic world, has a role to play in that as well. They tend to have more flexibility, which is great. But at the same time, when we're looking at systemic issues, right, how to change the rules of the game, what we're really talking about is public policy, those policy tools that government and government institutions are creating and enforcing. And not-for-profit organizations and philanthropic organizations can be creative. They can do experimental work at various sites. They can help fund research. They can really kind of spur some of that, but they're not the ones doing the regulating, if that makes sense. So I do think that public policy doesn't change without government being part of it. And so that's why I do think it's going to take a coalition, and different kinds of entities have different strengths. You mentioned some of these advocacy positions that have been taken by not-for-profit organizations over the years about the greenest building and economic benefits of historic preservation. Often those are coming out of not-for-profit organizations that are trying to perpetuate the status quo and trying to raise money and trying to defend our current position. And it isn't always looking at it from a cost-benefit analysis. Those kinds of organizations can't always afford to be critical and talk about the dimensions of a case study or of a policy that are not functioning well, because it might actually make preservation not look as good and therefore influence their fundraising capacity. So I think we need to be honest and open about what not-for-profits can do when it comes to policy reform. While there are some foundations and philanthropic organizations that are getting behind this notion, and I hope hopefully more, we need to also recognize the limitations of some of our key partners. They need to still be partners, but they may not be able to lead the charge on policy reform.
I will admit, even after reading the book, but until this conversation, Stephanie's the historic preservation planner. I am not. I do have a history degree. I love history, but I am not a preservationist overall. So it seemed to me, from an outsider's perspective, that it was going to be the nonprofits that would step in and maybe lead the next bit of charge for change and policy adherence. But I feel like you have changed my mind in this last bit of conversation there.
I think they have an important role to play. And certainly organizations like the National Trust and other, more local organizations have done really important work. I mean, the National Trust, they've been continuing to look at that question of preservation and existing buildings and carbon, for example, and they were supportive of the CARE tool, the development of the CARE tool, for example. So it's not to say that they can't do really good work, but I feel like we need to recognize that there's the need for a coalition exists because everyone's coming with different strengths and constraints, and that understanding those differences and being clear about those differences and not sort of saying, well, you're the premier preservation organization, you should be leading this charge. I don't think that gets us to the place we need to be.
As a person who works in government and believes in government, I'm really glad to hear that government will still have a solid role to play in preservation for years to come.
That is my hope. I believe in public institutions. I really do. And I believe that can be done in ways that doesn't simply bloat or turn government institutions into bigger entities. I do think that, again, being creative about our policy tools and how we empower communities in different ways to serve as partners and co-producers of heritage is critical to that.
And always our last question, as this is Booked on Planning. In addition to your book, which we recommend everyone get a copy of, what books would you recommend our readers check out?
So a book that I recently read that was written by a colleague, preservation planner, is Stephanie Ryberg Webster's Preserving the Vanishing City, where she talks about the very complicated history of Cleveland and the efforts of preservation and how that intersects with politics and race and all sorts of things. So I think that that's a really important way of understanding locality and the very different factors that come into play in questions of preservation. And then my book, and I even make an apology sort of towards the end of the book that I treat aesthetics somewhat harshly in the context of the volume, because I'm really looking at that social spatial relationship, not at the object. But one of the books that has brought me great joy in the last year is the book on the Garrick by John Vinci, Reconstructing the Garrick, which was a Louis Kahn building that was demolished in Chicago, and the very creative and interesting ways in which activists came together to try and document and salvage parts of that building. And I think that it's so demonstrative of the very creative ways in which preservation can manifest.
Two great books to add to, for sure, my list. I'm a big reader anyways, but I'm always looking for other preservation books too. Erica, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book, Second Order Preservation, Social Justice and Climate Action Through Heritage Policy.
Thank you both for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with author Erica Avrami on her book, Second Order Preservation, Social Justice and Climate Action Through Heritage Policy. You can get your own copy through the publisher at the University of Minnesota Press or click the link in the show notes to take you directly to our affiliate page. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.